Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and explains 5 outstanding books in some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. In 1640, a theological treatise entitled Augustinus was published posthumously. Its subtitle was St. Augustine's Teaching Against the Pelagians and the Massalians on the Health, Sickness, and Medicine of Human Nature. Its author was Cornelius Jansen, who lived from 1585 to 1638. Jansen had been a professor at the University of Leuven and Bishop of Ypres, Flanders. In it, Jansen opposed certain Jesuit theologians, such as Luis de Molina, for their conception of grace and divine predestination. He defended instead what he took to be St. Augustine's doctrine on these matters. Before long, proponents of this school of Augustinianism were branded Jansenists by their opponents. Moreover, very soon they were widespread in France, thanks mainly to one of Jansen's like-minded friends from his student days, Shaun de Vergier de Hauranne, better known as the Abbé de Saint-Cyran. Saint-Cyran exerted this influence in his role as spiritual director and confessor of the Abbey of Port-Royal de Ypres, and through his association with the Arnauld family. Among the most influential figures associated with Port-Royal and the Jansenist movement were the Arnauld siblings, Marie-Angélique, Agnès, and Antoine, and also Blaise Pascal. The movement was opposed vehemently by Jesuits, French monarchs, and was even censored by various popes. Many historians believe that, though long gone, the Jansenist controversy influenced the development of modernity and the Church decisively. In this interview, Dr. Shaun Blanchard will discuss the Jansenist controversy, its impact, and some of the best books on the subject. Shaun Blanchard is lecturer in theology on the Fremantle campus of the University of Notre Dame, Australia. He writes on a variety of topics in early modern and modern Catholicism, publishing in outlets like Commonweal, America, Church Life Journal, and The Tablet. He is the author of The Synod of Pistoia in Vatican II, Jansenism and the Struggle for Catholic Reform, published by Oxford University Press. And with Ulrich Lehrer, he co-edited The Catholic Enlightenment, a global anthology. With Stephen Bullivant, he co-wrote Vatican II, a very short introduction, also published by Oxford University Press. And with Richard T. Yoder, he is the co-editor of Jansenism, an international anthology, which is forthcoming from Catholic University of America Press. Dr. Shaun Blanchard, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
You opened a 2018 article in Church Life Journal by mentioning how every now and then a friend or colleague asks me some variant of the question, so what is Jansenism? What's your answer to that question?
Well, I think at the time that I wrote that, I was really struggling to answer that question, so I wrote a short online essay about it. I think now I would say something like Jansenism was an extreme Augustinian reform movement that arose primarily in France, and the two there's a French scholar named Simon Icard, and he says the two fundamental lines of continuity in a movement that really changes and develops and is exported all these different places. But the two fundamental lines of continuity are a particular view of divine grace, kind of rigorous predestinarian Augustinian, and then really a commitment to an apocalyptic view of history, a specific form of apocalypticism. So that's the book I'm reading right now, this wonderful new book, Jansenism and Apocalypticism by Simon Icard. And he's convinced me so far. So if we want to speak of a continuity, I'd say it's these two things: a rigorous commitment to an extreme form of Augustinianism, and then a kind of apocalyptic interpretation of church history. However, as I explained in the article, what is called Jansenism is very diverse, and the term is used as a kind of symbolic shorthand for all kinds of tendencies, ideals, problems, etc.
You mentioned the teaching on grace and the views on the final times. Could you expand on those theses? I mean, what were the central Jansenist theses on grace, divine predestination, Christian moral life, and also the hierarchical structure of the church?
Okay, great. So I think a great way to understand Jansenism is to go back before the nuns of Port-Royal, and even before Jansen himself is active. And you have a series of disputes that arise in the 16th century. And of course, you have Luther and Calvin, but even within the bosom of the Catholic Church itself, you have the Jesuit Luis de Molina and his theory of middle knowledge, and he's trying to hold together this old tension problem, philosophical problem, pastoral problem of God's absolute power, God's divine will, God's clear. There's clear passages in Scripture about predestination, and yet there's also a belief that humans have been given free will, that God desires that all be saved, that humans stand with life and death before them, etc. So how do we reconcile this within the bosom of the church? Notwithstanding all the debates with Protestant reformers, there was really the Dominican position, physical pre-motion, Thomism, and then a perhaps more positive view of the human will that the Jesuits espoused, which came to be called Molinism. Now, this all comes to a head in the De Exiliis controversy, which spans a long period of time and is really ultimately inconclusive. So the papacy is really trying to hold together unity in difference, that there really are different views and different ways of resolving this conundrum. So you then have a Dutch scripture scholar. He was a professor at the University of Leuven. He's ultimately made a bishop. His name is Cornelius Jansen. And he believes that the way to solve this problem is really to go back to what he sees as the pure teaching of St. Augustine, who was the correct interpreter of Scripture. So actually, Catholic University of America Press, if I can sneak in another book recommendation, has come out with a translation. My friend and colleague Guido Stucco, an Italian-American, has translated part of Jansen's massive 3-volume tome. So really, Jansen's argument is that the Dominicans aren't heretical, but they have all this confusing medieval scholastic terminology, which we should mostly put away and go back to Augustine. And he does really make very strong accusations against the Jesuits. He essentially believes that they are semi-Pelagians, that they're not as bad as Pelagius, but they have revived a kind of, perhaps we could say, a caffeine-free form of Pelagianism, or diet Pelagianism, and that this is doing great theological and pastoral damage. Now, this is connected with a critique of moral theology, of practice in the confessional. That's not so much Jansen's critique himself. That comes a little bit later, and I'm sure we can talk about that with Pascal, with Antoine Arnauld. But this is a real wholesale attack on the Jesuit order. Now, linked with the Jesuits is their support of the papacy, what we would now call ultramontanism, and that term starts getting used around this time. So the Jansenists eventually come to be aligned very, very strongly with, they would say, not anti-papal, but anti-ultramontane. So they believe that papal authority has gotten completely out of control. One of the Jansenists that I talk about in my first book on the Synod of Pistoia, he says that the fisherman, Peter, the successor of Peter, has exchanged his keys, the keys of the kingdom, for the tiara of an emperor. So it comes to be a very holistic critique and really attack on one of the predominant forms of Catholicism, which was this more Jesuit, more ultramontane model, which of course in France, this is a real tug of war between competing groups and competing interests.
And were the Jansenists guilty, as was commonly alleged, of crypto-Calvinism?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that was, certainly a very common allegation. I think certainly on both sides had conspiracy theories about the other. Let me start by saying that. So there was an anti-Jansenist conspiracy theory that they were really deists and they were just trying to destroy the church from within by kind of injecting a Calvinist pessimism, which would get people away from the sacraments, etc. And then there were anti-Jesuit conspiracy theories. So the kind of initial accusation, and this was a serious accusation in France, which was post-wars of religion. I mean, they had not wars that weren't just motivated by religion, but certainly had a strong kind of Calvinist versus Catholic tinge to them. I would say that the Jansenists were certainly extreme Augustinians. If one sees the Augustinian theses as Calvinistic, then they were. But I don't think Jansen's getting the ideas from Calvinists as such. I think the accusation falls apart when you look at the sort of holistic perspective of the Jansenists, which includes, pretty standardly accepted Catholic views of sacraments and many other things. Could it lead to a kind of the problems one would associate with Calvinism? Certainly. So I guess I would somewhat hedge on that accusation.
And if we take the 1640 publication of Jansen's Augustinus as the year of Jansenism's birth, is it possible to date its death?
Yeah, another great question. I personally would argue that as a movement that has any real vital force within the church, I think Jansenism is dead by, I would say, the 1820s or 1830s. The last real offensive, the last real push for Jansenist reform was in the 1790s. And the leaders, so probably the most important Italians, Pietro Tamburini and Scipione de' Ricci, they die in 1810 and in 1827. And then Henri Gregoire, who was one of the constitutional bishops, so he's one of the bishops that supported the revolution, at least certain stages of it, he dies in 1831. I don't think there's a real generation after that of leadership, of people that had significant offices in the church or in the state that are promoting Jansenism. Were there isolated individuals who thought Jansenism was good or the Jansenists were right? Certainly there were. But as a movement, I would date it, let's say, about 1830. You have Pope Gregory the 16th is elected in 1831. That's seen as kind of the age of ultramontanism. So I would say around that time is a good demarcator. So we're looking at about 200 years of Jansenism as a movement.
You've argued that the accusations of Jansenism that are sometimes bandied around today constitute a misuse of the term, because Jansenism no longer exists. But what do people mean today when they call someone a Jansenist?
Yeah, so it's very common. I mean, one reason I got to be interested in this whole era and these conflicts as a grad student, I was a recent Catholic convert. And I would hear this term, and it was so surprising. I didn't know anything. I didn't know what this meant. And I remember I was a campus minister in Wisconsin, and a young man came up to me, and he had just gotten out of confession. He said, "Oh, I'm so worried that the priest said that I was being too much of a Jansenist. What is that?" And I said, "Oh, don't worry. He means you need to take it easy on yourself. You're maybe judging yourself a bit too strictly." And the young man very obviously very scrupulous, and he was so relieved. He goes, "Oh, so I'm not allowed to be that way. Okay, good." So my point in bringing up that kind of silly story, although I think it's not an uncommon story perhaps, is there is a real pastoral use of this term that I understand. The same way that in Protestant communities they would say, "Oh, don't be a Puritan. You know, we can have beer at our church cookout," or whatever the issue might be. Jansenist can be used in that way, and there's a way that can be harmless. My problem with it is when Jansenist is used as a kind of slogan or an accusation to shut down a debate. So if there's a debate about, so say for example and I'm sorry to wade into controversial territory, but the Amoris Laetitia debate. Okay, there's serious issues there. There's good people who are disagreeing about this question, divorce, remarriage, and reception of communion. So what I was trying to get at in this article is, don't just call your opponent a Jansenist. Actually take what they're saying seriously. These are important issues that people of goodwill are disagreeing about, and let's actually argue the issues. Let's not just smear each other. So you don't like Cardinal Burke, fine, but don't say he's a Jansenist. You don't like, there were also people who were saying Cardinal Casper is a Jansenist because he thinks, divine grace won't actually help people obey the commandments or whatever it might be. So I think it can be a lazy smear rather than something that sort of helpfully elucidates, our past and good things and bad things in our history.
And if Jansenism's long dead and gone, why do we still need to take it into consideration, if we need to take it into consideration at all?
Yeah, it might seem to be a bit contradictory that I talk so much about it, and I think it's so important, but I also say, this is dead. It's been dead for almost 200 years. I think that we can understand certain important psychological, theological, ecclesial dynamics by looking at and studying the Jansenist controversy closely. And there's many examples that I could give, but I'll just say one. So right now we're having a pretty charged debate, at least in the English-speaking world, and I would imagine in Rome too, about papal authority, the role of bishops conferences, and the role of laity, synodality or the reception of disciplinary and doctrinal decrees, whatever it might be. And like any other group of humans, we sometimes feel that we're experiencing something that's unprecedented. Americans love to say this is unprecedented in the history of the presidency, and it's usually not, or whatever it might be. It's the same thing with the church, and Jansenists, the Jansenist conflict can really illuminate the way that Catholics have debated and dealt with, either in healthy or unhealthy ways, productive or unproductive ways, these same debates. So that's why when I teach. So for example, I taught a class with seminarians and with theology majors last semester on liturgy, on the Eucharist, and I went back to some of the debates in the 18th century to say, hey, some of the tensions and problems, pastoral problems or polarization or whatever's going on has happened before. Okay, and let's look at and examine some of these people and what are they arguing and how is this resolved, and etc. So in that case, I think it's the Jansenist conflict, Jansenist-Jesuit conflict, Jansenist movement can really help us understand ourselves better and understand why we are where we are, and maybe help us not repeat some of the same mistakes.
There were three main papal interventions. The popes issued three documents condemning Jansenism. There were Innocent X's bull Cum Occasione from 1653, Alexander VII's bull Ad Sanctam Beati Petri Sedem from 1656, and also his apostolic constitution Regiminis Apostolici from 1665, which contained a formula of submission for the Jansenists, and Clement XI's bull Unigenitus from 1713. Could you briefly explain the motive, teaching, reception, impact of these papal documents?
Yeah, sure. So the first one is the easiest and the simplest. Cum Occasione is a condemnation of. I actually have a portrait of the Pope in question right here. My friend is a painter and he did a study of Velasquez. This is Innocent X. was a good gift to me. Essentially, the Sorbonne, the theology faculty in Paris, had extracted, I believe, initially 9 propositions from Jansen's book, Augustinus. This was the normal way a doctrinal censure would happen at that time. It would begin in a university faculty or with a local bishop and eventually make its way to Rome. A Roman committee then narrowed this down to 5 propositions. Pope Innocent signed off on it and promulgated it. So it was a condemnation of 5 propositions from Jansen's book, or allegedly, I should say, allegedly from Jansen's book, which were seen to, I think 4 were condemned as heretical, 1 was condemned as erroneous, near heresy, something like that, seen to essentially verge into a kind of crypto-Calvinism and extreme Augustinianism. Okay. Now, what that bull didn't do was say Jansen is a heretic. These propositions definitely are in the book, and now the book's a heretical book. So it was very careful. The second that you mentioned, so we'll call this the formulary crisis. So the Jansenists respond to this, or the people who are called Jansenists respond to this by saying, we accept the right of the Pope to condemn error. We only dispute the fact, whether in fact these propositions are in the book. Okay, so Louis XIV, the King of France, is really annoyed and says, I'm sick of these people, I'm sick of their distinctions. He asks Rome for a more clear condemnation, and the next Pope, Innocent, had passed away. So the next Pope comes through with a formulary which says, I acknowledge that these propositions are in fact in the book, and I condemn them in the way that the author intended them. Okay, because that was another sort of way of dancing around a condemnation. Okay, that has a heretical interpretation, but it also has a orthodox interpretation. So the formulary is trying to close off any sort of loophole to not view the book as heretical or at least doctrinally problematic. A couple years later, there's a kind of tacit peace. It's called the Peace of the Church, where essentially the next pope allows there to be a kind of distinction between fact and right. Okay, that there are errors that the pope has the right to condemn, and yet he's not making a judgment about Jansen as a person or his intent. That breaks down in the late 1600s. Mostly through factors in France, personal rivalries. Fénelon, for example, was deeply anti-Jansenist. Doctors in the Sorbonne arguing. So the whole controversy really flares back up, and the standard bearer of the second generation of Jansenists is a man named Pasquier-Quesnel, who's a former Oratorian, and he had written a very influential biblical commentary called Moral Reflections on the New Testament. It was a verse by verse commentary. So Louis XIV, the King of France, is getting really sick of Jansenism. He decides to destroy the convent of Port-Royal, which was the sort of center of it. He exiles the nuns. They're put into sort of different religious houses around France. And then he solicits from Rome a kind of what is meant to be the final definitive condemnation of Jansenism. They're the committee in Rome doesn't want to make the same mistakes as they see it of cum occasionis, so they extract verbally, literally, these 101 statements of Quesnel, and they condemn them, or rather Clement the 10th, Pope Clement the 11th signs off on the condemnation. Now, again, there's a little bit of ambiguity because he doesn't say proposition number 1, heretical, proposition 2, erroneous, proposition 3, offensive to pious ears. All of the condemnations are put at the end. It's called in globo condemnation. So it lists all of the possible censures, but it doesn't apply them to each individual proposition. So then you have decades of theologians arguing about this, people writing their dissertations about it, things like this. So unigenitus is more exact than the initial condemnations, but still leads to a huge amount of theological and actually in France political controversy, because it's seen as a struggle between absolutist authority, the absolutist authority of the crown, which is linked with the papacy, ironically, for the Gallican French, and the authority of local clergy, the parliaments, things like that. So unigenitus really becomes a lightning rod of division, even for people who have no interest in debating divine grace and free will and stuff like that.
With these papal censures, were the Jansenists treated fairly?
I think it's safe to say that I would say that they were treated unfairly, and yet I would also say they brought a lot of their problems on themselves. So in this sense, it's sort of the reverse of the adage in Alice in Wonderland, all have won and all shall have prizes. It's sort of the reverse of that. It's kind of a pox on everyone's house. I think it's a really sad episode in church history where you have some really good people on both sides of this dispute. And because of competing, I think, some sinful personalities and some personal rivalries, as well as some powerful systems, the French monarchy, the papacy, I think it's essentially a kind of just sad, regrettable episode. I do think, of course, being that I'm a 21st century Catholic, the view of divine grace to me is quite foreign and quite bleak, and in our age of hoping for the salvation of all, it's the old massa damnata, that the great majority of human beings will be damned, is a pretty horrifying thing to read in Jansen. Nevertheless, some of his opponents who emphasized free will didn't necessarily believe that the vast majority of people wouldn't be damned either. So it's difficult to look back on the debate about grace, and to some extent the debate about penance can at times seem foreign. But yeah, I would say we've certainly moved away as a church. I think happily, gladly, rightly moved away from many of the Jansenist ideas. Nevertheless, they also upheld, I think, some beautiful things in the Catholic faith around reading Scripture, liturgy, the right of lay people to speak their minds. I think the dignity of the office of local bishop. I mean, these are all positive things. So I see it as a mixed bag, and I honestly see it as a kind of, like the First World War is just kind of a catastrophe. It's hard to sort of say who's right and who's wrong holistically. So that's what I'd say about it.
And were the Jansenists and the Jesuits arch enemies?
Yes, certainly, yeah. And I would say the same thing about the Jesuits. I would say that that they had certain ideals that I think we've moved away from, and then they really were preserving some beautiful things about the Christian faith as well. So I mean, it's a really fiery and divisive and sad conflict between these really, there's remarkable people on both sides of this. Jesuit missionaries, amazing nuns, but they're arch enemies, sadly. No question about that.
And as you've already mentioned, the theological disputes were often intertwined in opposition to Jansenism with political motivations. What were the political motivations or motives for the opposition to Jansenism?
Well, the real origins of this is Jansenism becomes a movement during a time of civil instability in France. So these civil wars going on in France. And the Jansenists are seen to side, and I think in some cases did, with the nobility against the king. The Jansenists always had a connection through the Arnauld family with the parliaments, which were sort of soft checks on royal power. So Louis XIV emerged from these civil wars, a theoretically absolutist king, although there were kind of practical, just like the papacy, there's always pragmatic checks on power. And Louis XIV decided that Jansenists were infected with a kind of subversive or disobedient spirit They wanted to debate his ideas or debate his decrees rather than obeying him. So he really ties his authority, and again, this is kind of ironic given the Gallican versus Ultramontane paradigms, but he really ties his authority to the papacy. He wants his authority, his throne, to be clearly aligned with the papal altar. Jansenists are then sort of set in opposition to this. So the Pope is not on their side insofar as he has condemned Jansen's book, at least in theory, and the king is not on their side insofar as he sees them as one of many factors that is destabilizing France. You know, Louis thought the same thing of certain political enemies. He certainly thought this way about Protestants, and he treated all of his enemies, you know, roughly the same, I think. There's a long story of how this all develops. It gets exported around the Catholic world, so you will find sort of what you could call philo-Jansenist, Jansenist sympathizers, all the way in Latin America when they're arguing for republics against the Spanish or Portuguese crown. You'll find in Austria, the enlightened absolutists under Emperor Joseph II are often philo-Jansenists. So you find various iterations of a political kind of interest or influence that Jansenism can have, but the origins of this are really in a particular situation in France.
The first recommended book is Blaise Pascal's The Provincial Letters. This series of 18 fictitious letters was published between 1656 and 1657. In them, Monsieur Louis de Molina informs his friends in the provinces of the theological disputes raging in Paris. The first four deal with grace, the rest are an attack on the casuistry of certain Jesuit moral theologians. Pascal used the Summula Casum Conscientiae of Antoni Escobar, a Jesuit, as his source book of the casuist opinions, and Antoine Arnaud's The Moral Theology of the Jesuits to critique them. Why does this book top your list?
Well, I think the Provincial Letters is a really exciting, enjoyable, fun way to enter into the conflict. Why did this conflict matter to so many people? Because there would have been so many people walking around in Paris who had no interest in De Auxiliis. They didn't know about, you know, Thomist views of physical pre-motion or middle knowledge or anything like that. But the Provincial Letters really brings what was once a very scholastic theological debate into the mainstream of the culture. Everyone has had an experience of thinking about, you know, there's this thing that I probably shouldn't do, and I'm thinking about whether there's some angle with which I can justify it. Okay, now confessors have to think about all these tough cases, and they have to take people in their concrete realities, and it's so in some sense the Provincial Letters are a bit unfair to confessors, because Pascal sort of gives the impression that this is just simple and this is just easy and we kind of know what the right thing is, and that's not always the case. Nevertheless, he's attacking a kind of decadence in French culture that I think a lot of French people, looking at the, you know, the opulence of the aristocracy or the amount of kind of profligate sexual practices that were going on, extreme wealth, things like that. There was a sense that there's something outrageous at the heart of culture, which I'm sure a lot of us feel today in the West as well. And here you have this amazing satire that's kind of, you know, deflating it like a pin into a balloon, and sort of showing the absurdity of how one might justify whatever obviously wrong thing that they're repeatedly doing. So I think that it's the kind of book that, for example, I taught a moral theology class last semester, and I gave two of the letters to my students, and they really enjoyed them, and they were able to kind of relate to them about, you know, it's not so different today, and people will, you know, post things anonymously on the internet and say, hey, what do you think about this circumstance or that circumstance? Or people in confession will have a crisis of conscience, of, you know, so in that sense, Pascal's putting his finger on the human condition, and he's bringing what could be a stodgy technical theological debate kind of into the mainstream of the culture. And I think this helps us understand why the Jansenist crisis or conflict involved so many people for so many years.
did Pascal influence Alexander VII's condemnation of laxists such as Thomas Sanchez in 1666?
I think it's certainly fair to say that the great tide of what we might call rigorist authors, Pascal certainly being one of them, influenced these papal teaching documents, certainly. Whether Pascal himself influenced that particular document, I don't know, but I would say that certainly the general backlash against probabilism, which was widespread, strong in France and strong in other Catholic nations, certainly directly influenced the Pope. The popes were trying really hard to be the referees and sort of set up the out-of-bounds lines. And they wanted a legitimate plurality of the theological schools. They did not want to condemn Augustinianism as such. They did not want to condemn Thomism, and they did not want to condemn Molinism. And it was the same thing with these moral positions. They really wanted there to be a legitimate plurality of pastoral formation and how Catholics reasoned morally, but they wanted the extremes to be out of bounds, and they were worried that after the condemnation of Jansenism, that a more laxist view was prevailing. And that's why you see a series of actually quite rigorous moral statements coming out of the Vatican, to the point where some of the anti-Jansenists were actually slandering, I believe it was Pope Innocent the 11th, Blessed Innocent the 11th. They were actually slandering him as a closet Jansenist. Because of the real vehemence with which he was condemning moral errors. So it really was a complicated dance for the papacy of what they were really trying to say. What their perspective is, they're saving the church from serious error on any extreme. And they had certainly come down against the Augustinian extreme when it came to divine grace, and now they were rebuking what you might see as an outcrop of a kind of Molinist probabilism.
One Archbishop of Paris, Antoine de Perfix de Beaumont, famously described the nuns of Port-Royal as pure as angels, as proud as devils. However, they were also extremely learned, and your second recommended book is John J. Connolly, S.J.'s Adoration and Annihilation, the Convent Philosophy of Port-Royal. It's a study of the writings of two of the Arnauld sisters and their niece, Marie-Angélique de Saint-Jean, who served as abbesses of Port-Royal. The book contains ample excerpts from their writings. Have you chosen this book because these three abbesses of Port-Royal give us an insight into the Jansenist doctrines, or rather because, as women who participated learnedly in theological debates, they are quite remarkable for the time?
Yeah, I would say both. I mean, I wanted one of the choices to be really directly centered on Port-Royal, one of my 5 recommended books. I thought this was a good option. John J. Connolly, he continues this tradition, typically Catholic tradition, of some of the best historians of Jansenism are Jesuits. Which is ironic, and we have Pope Francis releasing this letter praising Blaise Pascal recently. So there's this. I thought that kind of dynamic is of interest. But yeah, certainly if you're getting into Jansenism, you want to learn more about it. It's irreplaceable. Fundamental place to start is with the Convent of Port-Royal, and these are really remarkable women. I think some of the most interesting women in the history of Christianity. There's a real severity here. It can seem foreign to our world in certain ways, and yet they write with really moving beauty about Christ, about prayer, about being overwhelmed by divine love, the absolute necessity of love. And when our kind of selfishness and sin is burned away, there's really no sense of duty or law anymore. There's a real sense of closeness to God, utter abandonment to God, and things like that. So it's coming out of, these women are coming out of a real revival. Only part of this revival is Augustinian, or rather is Jansenist. I mean, you have the whole French school of spirituality in the 17th century, Francis de Sales. These women are very influenced by Cardinal Bérulle, the founder of the French Oratory. So you see in these women a real amazing blend of all kinds of influences. They're great fans of, I'm forgetting his name, the wonderful Cistercian, the 12th century Cistercian.
Bernard of Clairvaux.
Yeah, Bernard of Clairvaux. They're great devotees of him. They've really imbibed this kind of Christocentric Augustinian renewal you get with Bérulle. The first abbess, Angélique Arnauld, was a correspondent at one point with Francis de Sales. So you get a real sense of kind of the overwhelming spiritual genius that was present in France in the 17th century in many different groups. And then you get a real window into what is the kind of theological core of Port-Royal and of Jansenism.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.